Hi, everyone. Welcome to the second session of IPS Singapore Perspectives Conference 2021 Reset. I'm Faisal from IPS. This session is entitled Environment and Sustainability. And before I introduce the moderator and hand over the session to her, please do let me run through some brief admin matters. Please submit your questions for the panelists via Pigeonhole in the questions submission section on this forum's page. You can do this at any time during the session. We invite all our conference participants to contribute to the discussions in a respectful and safe manner, focusing on the issues at hand. However, IPS reserves the right to act in a way to ensure that it is always the case in all of the chat or Q&A functions at our conference site. This session will be moderated by Dr. Corinne Ong. She is the Deputy Director and Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Water Policy, Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. I shall now hand over to Corinne, please. Corinne, over to you.
Thank you very much, Faisal, for the introduction. A very good afternoon to everyone, and thank you for joining us on this forum on environment and sustainability. I'm very glad to be moderating this forum, which I consider very apt in relation to the conference theme, Reset. Without doubt, COVID-19 has upended the momentum in which we have conducted our economic, social, and political affairs in Singapore and worldwide. Yet, despite these disruptions, optimists believe that the pandemic could well provide a window of opportunity for us to reset our perspectives and prompt reflection on the sustainability of our existing actions. In thinking about the future of our environment and sustainability, there is increasing realization that planning for the future really means acting now. And over the years, Singapore and many countries around the world have made watershed investment and policy commitments towards environmental protection and sustainability. Yet, critics believe that more needs to be done, more strategically, with greater urgency, and involving more stakeholders in this effort. So our conversation today will center around an exploration of what Singapore and others have achieved on the sustainability front and exploring the potential for more impactful change. Joining me today is a very distinguished panel whose accomplishments and contributions to academia and society are evident in their speaker biographies. So I'm very excited to have them here with us today and look forward to a very engaging dialogue with them as well as with you, the audience. So I'd like to introduce our first speaker for the forum, Associate Professor Simon Tay. Prof. Tay teaches international law at the National University of Singapore. Prof. Tay is also chairman of the Singapore Institute of International Affairs and senior consultant at Wong Partnership. Prof. Tay has served as an expert advisor to policymakers and corporations, so I'm very excited to learn what he has to share with us on this topic today. Prof. Tay, over to you.
Thank you very much, Corinne. Thank you, IPS, for inviting me. It was my pleasure to be in several of the Singapore perspectives for IPS back in the 2000s and earlier, and I'm delighted to return to this forum. In many ways, this topic and the way we discuss it would have been completely impossible a decade ago or even a few years ago. I think, as the title overall says, reset is the right way to look at it. In the 15 minutes I have today, I thought I'd share some of the global, national, and regional impulses and changes that are making this reset possible. And then in particular, I wanted to zoom in of what I think is both a challenge and an opportunity for Singapore and ASEAN, where much of my work and the SWIA's work features, and where much of Singapore's economy is and will be. I have a few slides. I hope I can share them with you. Would you put on slide 1, please? Thank you. Oh, that's just me. The next one, please. As I mentioned, I think there really are global, national, and also regional issues at stake in looking forward at climate and sustainability or environment. At the global level, I think this bears little repetition. The efforts of climate change and the Sustainable Development Goals have really ramped up in the last few years. This is doubled by the pandemic, Many governments, and especially the EU, have called for a green recovery and put sizable amounts of budget into it. Moreover, the latest moving piece is the USA. While President Trump took Americans out of the Paris Agreement on climate change, incoming President Joe Biden has pledged to and reinforced this with almost every speech is given post-victory. When the Americans come in, and they will, it will mean that over 60% of the world will have some cap or commitment to carbon neutrality. In our own region, China, Japan, and Korea, all sizable economies with important value chains through the region, have also committed to carbon neutrality, zero. In this sense, the pace of commitments, the pace of trying to make things work has increased at the global level. Where there was much talk and no action, I think we're looking forward to a period where there will be both talk and action. At the national level, though, I'd say that it can never be enough. While governments are committed, they will face excoriations and sometimes anger from a younger generation that expect those commitments to move even faster than they are. And that's why I have Greta Thunberg on the screen. If you look at what she's been saying, it's not just the content, it is the tone. There is an expectation of speed and also inclusion in this effort towards moving towards climate change action and sustainability. At the national level here in Singapore, I think many of the country, companies and citizens are also pushing for action. Perhaps not in the same aggressive tone, but with increased expectations. There is a degree of anxiety. Within Singapore, we have had a strong green DNA right from the start. Under Lee Kuan Yew, we have always been and tried to be a green, clean, and green nation. And this has been amplified by our consciousness over lack of resources and the need to move from green parks to much more being in nature. But the critical commitment has been made last year during the National Day Rally, 2019, by PM Lee Hsien Loong, when he committed to taking action on climate change and put some baseline numbers and concerns on the table in the largest national forum that Singapore has. This actually did not come out of the blue. It capped over a decade of work by the Climate Change Coordination Committee, headed by then Deputy Prime Minister and now Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean. I'm very committed. I'm very convinced that the government is committed towards making real steps and understands where investments will start to pay off in terms of our carbon move towards carbon neutrality. There is, however, some caution. So Singapore has not joined Korea, Japan, or China in pledging towards carbon neutrality. Our current commitments have increased under the Paris Agreement, but are not in the same ballpark as some people would want us to be as a more developed country in our region. That brings me to my third point about the region. For more than 2 decades, we've struggled with something on the image there called the transboundary haze pollution. This really is a stark signal fire, literally, that reminds us of the regional interdependence and our vulnerability, a very small country. In the last years, however, I'm pleased to say the SWA has observed and tried to help foster much more positive signs from the Indonesian government that prioritizes under President Jokowi their own concerns and their own vulnerabilities of their people nearest the fires. Moreover, the resource sector companies and those who buy from them and those who finance them have also started to understand the signal towards sustainability. In this sense, it is not only governments and citizens, but corporations and markets. In this sense, I want to, in a way, tell us that we're moving towards more climate and sustainability values, ethical values, our own values as individuals. Yes, that's always been understood. But now the developing part is the value of a company, the sustainability of the investments. And the pandemic has reinforced this when environmental ESG funds have been outperforming most other investments. There are, in this sense, always challenges, risks, but increasingly there are opportunities. Let me move on then to what the opportunities are in our region in particular. Can I have the next slide, please? One of the SWA's work has really been about the transboundary haze and climate change. We've understood the problems and we've tried to understand how the situation can get better. In this sense, over the last year, we've noticed the Indonesian fires are at least smaller areas, but the higher greenhouse gas emissions that come out from the peatlands. And this is making our region, and Indonesia in particular, one of the growing and largest emitters of climate change gases in the world. Next slide, please. But while this problem has been in long existence, what has been the moving arrow is the growing momentum for ESG and climate action among the businesses. Now, in the 1990s, when I took up this issue as a nominated member of parliament, I was one of the few, together with Prof. Tommy Koh, to excoriate the companies and call for laws that would punish them here in Singapore. I'm pleased to say that not only have the laws been passed, but in the years since then, most of the major companies have undertaken commitments. Moreover, in this year's study, the SWA think tank that I chair has found that these commitments continue and continue to be funded by these major companies, even during this downturn that all of us are feeling in the pandemic. For this reason, partly the very wet weather we've been experiencing, our region has not had as many fires in 2020 as some of the other parts of the world have had, like California. In this sense, the next step is moving from risk to global markets rewarding sustainability. Singapore is making steps towards green finance, and so are our neighbors. The Singapore Exchange has put ESG reporting on the agenda, and so will Malaysia and soon Indonesia if their plans go through. In this sense, we too in Singapore and the region will need to follow the lead of Europeans and others to really move towards a green recovery, a stimulus that will help not only the economic recovery as a whole, but the other pillars of ESG and sustainability, the environment and the people, towards inclusive development. May I have the next slide, please? Or is that the only slide? Beyond the next one, please. Yes. So this is when we have the opportunities. I think there really is a very strong opportunity for the green recovery. And in that sense, Singapore must work beyond our shores. We already have an economy that clearly depends and invests in many of the countries around us. We're one of the top investors, if not number one, in Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, Myanmar. We can and should use this economic engagement to further our green recovery and green opportunity. All the countries around us now are making commitments under the Paris Agreement, but there has been very little coordination in ASEAN. In 2019, I keep saying last year, sorry, in 2019 was the first time that the then ASEAN chairman, Thailand, made a statement on behalf of the group rather than each country individually. But that statement was one short paragraph and rather general. I think one of the great opportunities is for ASEAN to work together to recognize our interdependence and vulnerabilities, and also the opportunities that we as a common market and common investment destination can make on the green front. To get the group moving as a whole, though, we may need bilateral agreements. Singapore has done bilateralism before on trade and investment, and should try the approach again in terms of stimulating climate action in the region and carbon markets. We can create the frameworks for opportunities, investments in carbon markets with our nearby neighbors like Indonesia, Myanmar, and even Brunei, which has made sizable commitments to move away from their own carbon fossil fuel economy. In this sense, the forest and nature-based solutions are one place to look, very obviously, but also clean energy. In the last decade, Singapore really ramped up our capabilities to be a leading proponent of solar energy and to finance the installation of solar energy to a region that needs the growth and needs the growth in energy, but hopefully clean energy. I think there's one more slide. In this regard, Singapore, to remind ourselves, accounts for just 0.11% of global emissions. As PM has said before, even if we shut off everything in Singapore, it wouldn't make a global difference. But as a financial hub, as a technology and innovation hub, as one of the voices in ASEAN, we can make an outsized contribution. Using our trade and finance levers, we can really set the tone for a recovery that will be a green one. There are technical issues that have to be addressed. There will be needs to have guidelines for green finance and really to make sure that sustainability incentive schemes are money well spent rather than wasted. We must stand for high standards rather than greenwashing. Singapore can and should develop, therefore, expertise to provide carbon services in carbon footprinting, to understand the value chains, in trying to get the other elements of verification, monitoring, so that people who invest their money, just as they did in the financial market, if they invest money in the carbon market that we hope to create, will not be cheated, but will be duly governed. I think that really we are at a threshold. Recently, the SWI conducted a talk with Coordinating Minister from Indonesia, Luhut, as well as our own Minister for Sustainability, Grace Fu. It was remarkable in the sense that Minister Grace Fu has embraced that her name of change of her ministry is more than just nomenclature. The word sustainability is there in the frame, and so is climate change. Additionally, the movement of green finance driven by MAS and banks has really grown. And I'm quite proud to say again that the distance and trajectory of growth in the last 3 years has been quite rapid from the time when SWA and I conducted a baseline survey. I think that the opportunities are really there at this time. And in the year to come, a mixture of private sector efforts, citizen concerns, but also government cooperation, bilaterally and on the regional ASEAN platform, will move us further in the next few years than we have in the last decade or more. Let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Tay, for your insights. So we'll now move to our second speaker. Our second speaker is Professor Alex Edmonds, who is Professor of Finance at London Business School and Academic Director of the Centre for Corporate Governance. Unfortunately, Prof. Edmonds is not able to join us live for this session due to an unexpected travel disruption he experienced arising from the COVID situation in the UK. However, Prof. Edmonds has kindly dedicated a recorded video for us, so we will still be able to hear from this academic expert who has actually made news with his TED Talks and 2020 book titled Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit, which he actually talks about. So let's tune in to Prof. Edmonds now.
Well, thanks so much for the invitation to be here. I'm delighted to do so, and I'm really sorry that I can't do this live. It's unfortunately 4 a.m. at my time. So what I'm going to speak to is the power of sustainable business. And I think a good place to start is to explain, well, what I mean by sustainable business to begin with. We might think it's obvious, but in fact, I'm going to have a quite different view of a sustainable business to what we typically hear. And to do this, let me take you on a journey. So let me take you outside your home offices to another country. So I'm going to take you to the Great Rift Valley. So this stretches across 2 continents and 6,000 kilometers from Lebanon and Asia to Mozambique and Africa. And it has some of the world's highest mountains, but it also has some of the world's deepest lakes. And one of these lakes is called Lake Magadi, which is in the Kenyan stretch of the Great Rift Valley. Now, you might think it's hard to imagine that you're here because you haven't seen it before, but in fact, you might have seen it before in not the small screen of your home computer, but on the big screen of a movie theatre. You might have seen it in the movie The Constant Gardener, based on the John le Carré novel of the same name. And indeed, millions of people around the world have seen this lake because they've seen this movie, but fewer than 1,000 people call the lake their home. And one of these people is a gentleman called Emmanuel Saronga, who makes a living selling and herding goats. Now, for Emmanuel, it used to be that cash was king. It's cash that he'd get if he sold a goat. He'd have to check that cash at risk of forgery. He'd have to store it at risk of robbery. And to bank that cash, he had to walk to the nearest bank, which was 1 day away. So Emmanuel's life was really tough. Right? He couldn't graze his goats on the greenest pastures. He had to always be within 1 day of a bank. But all of that changed in 2007 due to what I would call a sustainable business. And that sustainable business was Vodafone, the UK telecoms giant. Because in 2007, Vodafone launched M-Pesa, which is a mobile money service in Kenya. And that allowed Kenyans to transfer money using their mobile phones without ever having to deal with cash. And this transformed Emmanuel's life, right? He no longer needs to worry about forgery or robbery. He can graze his goats where he wants to, and he has a record of every single transaction on his phone. And we don't want to make a big thing out of just one story, but large-scale evidence shows that within the first 7 years of the launch of M-Pesa, 200,000 households in Kenya got lifted out of poverty. And many of these households were headed up by women because it allowed them to move from agriculture to business and retail. So there was a big effect on gender parity. So that's one story that I have on Vodafone. But now let me tell you a quite different story. And this different story surrounds taxes. So in 2012, Vodafone became the first telecoms company around the world to release a tax transparency report showing how much tax they were paying to governments worldwide. And that's really important in telecoms because you could choose to locate your licenses in low tax countries. So I've got two questions for everybody here to think about. Which of these decisions created most value for society? That's the first question. And the second is, which of these decisions, if it were not taken, would have led to the most public outrage or worsened Vodafone's CSR rating or reputation? Now, I'm pretty sure that most people would agree with the answers. So, which decision created most value for society? It was the first one. By launching M-Pesa, they lifted 200,000 households out of poverty and contributed towards gender parity. But what would have been the outrage, turning to the second question, if Vodafone had not launched M-Pesa? It would have been nothing. Well, you don't get into trouble for not launching an innovation. Like, nobody would have boycotted Vodafone because they would have never thought it was ever possible to do this crazy idea of banking without a bank. But what is the outrage of not being transparent on tax? It could be huge, right? And indeed, Vodafone themselves had suffered a nationwide boycott of its stores 2 years previously for allegedly dodging tax. So what is the message I'm giving with these two stories? It's to rethink our notion of sustainable business. Like, we often think that sustainability is about the answer to the second question. Do no harm. Don't cheat on taxes. Don't pollute the environment. Don't mistreat your workers. And absolutely, sustainability is about that. That is really, really important. I'm not trying to underplay that. But what I'm doing is I want to shift our thinking on sustainability, because you already knew that companies should do no harm even before hearing my talk. So what I want to do is to provide a different perspective. I want to shift our view on sustainability towards the answer to the first question, because I believe that given the scale of the world's challenges in 2021, it's not enough for a company to just do no harm. It needs to be actively doing good and actively creating value. And so this is linked to the framework I introduced in a recent book. So we often view the value that a company creates as being given by a pie. And that pie can be split either to investors in the form of profits, or to stakeholders of society in the form of higher taxes, higher wages, or lower carbon emissions. And we often think a sustainable company is one that splits the pie fairly, doesn't make too much money, makes sure that there's enough for others to go around. And absolutely, that is part of sustainability. But what I want to stress is this approach to sustainability is limited. And it's limited for at least two reasons. The first is that if sustainability is only about splitting the pie differently, then, well, companies won't want to do it voluntarily, right? So if sustainability means companies are less profitable, CEOs will practice sustainability to the minimum possible. And so the only way that we can impose sustainability is through regulating, but regulation can only lead to compliance with a law rather than CEOs being truly committed. They will just do the minimum possible to not flout the regulation. The second reason why sustainability can't just be about splitting the pie differently is that it's bad for investors. Now, many people might think, I don't care, right? We often like to portray investors as nameless, faceless capitalists. Investors are them, society is us, and if we can take from them and give to us, then it makes people much better off. But investors are not them, they are us. They include parents saving for their children's education, pension funds investing for retirement, and insurance companies funding future claims. So any repurposing of business must take investors seriously. Investors play a critical role in the sustainability of the economy. So this is why my view of business, of sustainability, is it's about growing the pie. It's about actively creating value. Yes, we do want to increase the orange, but we do this not by giving society a greater share of what's already there, but by being relentlessly committed to innovation and excellence and coming up with some crazy ideas, right? Like banking without a bank, and creating value through society with those ideas. And the nice thing about creating value for society in that way, in growing the pie rather than splitting it, is that it's also good for investors. Because Vodafone genuinely launched M-Pesa not to make money, but to solve a social problem. But as a byproduct, Vodafone was able to monetize it, and eventually investors benefited. So I view a sustainable business as one that creates profits only through creating value for society. So let's pick apart this definition. What those final 4 words won't be that new to you. You knew that sustainability was about creating value before hearing me talk. But what I want to stress is that it's important to create profits as well, because a sustainable business must be sustainable for investors. But another important word here is only. What you can create profits through extracting value from society by polluting the environment, for example. And so the word only means that we start with creating value as the end goal. But if we create value successfully through innovating, through solving social problems, then ultimately a company will become more profitable. So at this point, you might think, well, everything Alex says, that sounds great, but it's a bit too good to be true. Like, where's the evidence? Well, it would be great if indeed companies that were creating value for society were magically more profitable, but that seems like wishful thinking. So this is indeed why most of my work as a professor is to look at the rigorous evidence to show that actually in the data it is the case that companies that serve society are also more profitable. And in the book I go through all of this evidence, but I'm not going to go through this today because in the interest of time, I want to instead focus on how to put it into practice. How can a company become more sustainable? And so the answer is by being driven by purpose. So what does the word purpose actually mean? It's bandied around a lot, but people often mention it without discussing what it means. So often companies might have a purpose statement like this. Our purpose is to serve customers, workers, suppliers, the environment, and communities and investors. Sounds great, right? We often think that purpose is about altruism. But it's not, right? If we think about it, right, the word purpose is about being focused and targeted. Right, a purposeful meeting is one with a clear agenda. If I do something on purpose, I do it deliberately. So what a purposeful company is one that clearly defines what it should be doing and importantly, what it should not. So I define purpose as why an enterprise exists, who it serves, its reason for being, and the role it plays in the world. So we have so many social problems out there. We've got the coronavirus, climate change, income inequality, automation, resource depletion, and so on. It is not your responsibility to solve all of the world's problems. Instead, you need to focus on the couple of problems that you can move the needle the most. Right? So it should be focused and targeted. Also, it should be as much about what not to do as what to do. So let me give some examples which I deliberately chosen from Singapore. So let's take Olam, the agribusiness. Right, its purpose is to develop prosperous farmers and food systems, thriving communities, and regeneration of the living world. And why that's striking is it focuses on the environment and communities and suppliers, but it doesn't say something about customers and workers, right? Even though customers and workers are important for many firms, but Olam says, well, what's particularly important for us as an agri-business is the environment and communities and suppliers. They are particularly material to us. And as we know, purpose is not just about a lofty sounding statement. We want to put it into practice. So how do we do that? Well, often it will involve trying to come up with measures to track whether you're on target. So let me go through another Singapore agribusiness just to balance it up, Wilmo International. Well, it has targets for the number of smallholder farmers that it enrolls in its supports programs in order to provide training and to disseminate best practice. And it tracks that just like it will track profits. What's another thing about putting purpose into practice? It's to do things to serve stakeholders rather than make money. And then you view profits as being a byproduct out of serving your stakeholders. For example, Standard Chartered Singapore office has this Skills Future at SC program where they provide employees with skills development. Why? Because they know that technology is changing skills. They want their workers to get ahead of this. Now, they do this without calculating, if I was to train my employees, they'll be this much more productive and I'll make this much more money. They just do this because they care about their employees as people. They want them to be skilled and to have training. Now, ultimately, yes, that will make them money. And my research supports this. It shows that if you treat your workers well, you become more profitable. But making more money was never the objective of this skills development program. It was genuine concern for your people, and you view profits as a byproduct. Okay, so in terms of further reading, so as I mentioned, I released this book just a few months ago called Grow the Pie, How Great Companies Deliver Both Purpose and Profit. And why I wrote this is to highlight the business case for purpose. I think for too long, sustainability was viewed as an optional extra to be buried in a CSR department. I'm saying, no, this is something that CEOs should care about. It's fundamental to the long-term commercial success of your business. I'm a finance professor, right? I care about the companies making money, but purpose is not at the expense of making money. It actually supports it. And this is not based on wishful thinking, but rigorous research. But often this rigorous research is written in very boring and turgid ways for academic journals. I wanted to translate it into simple language, bring it to life with a clear framework for how to put it into practice and some real life examples. So I thought that this will hopefully be a valuable resource for anybody wanting to build a sustainable business. Thank you so much again for the opportunity. I'm so sorry that I'm not able to participate in the Q&A just because of the time zone. However, if anyone would like to follow up, please do drop me a note on LinkedIn via LinkedIn Messenger. Again, it's Alex Edmonds. I commit to answering any other messages that I get. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of the conference.
So I hope everyone enjoyed Prof. Edmonds' talk from where he was. It was certainly an engaging one for me. So now that we have heard from all of our speakers, we will now be turning to our three discussants who will be sharing their views towards the speakers' presentations. So let's introduce these discussants in no order of importance. Firstly, we have Mr. Munib Matni, who is founder of Penaki Partners, a Singapore funds management firm. Munib is also Chief Investment Officer and Lead Project Manager of the Global Penvest Fund. And secondly, we have Ms. Melissa Loh, who is Research Fellow at the Energy Studies Institute at the National University of Singapore. Last but not least, we have Mr. Veerapan Swabinathan, who is Founder and Director of the Sustainable Living Lab. So over to you, Munib, if you'd like to just start us off with your 5-minute discussion. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you so much. I hope you can hear me here. First of all, thank you to IPS. Thank you to Professor Tay and also Professor Edmonds for setting the stage here. A bit of background, I am one of those nameless, faceless, and in the past, maybe shameless investors that Professor Edmonds talked about, who in the past were argued as being the cause of a lot of the, let's say, unsustainability in our economic and system. I've, for 25 years, done maybe that, but in the last few years, I've definitely been focused on sustainability. And I've also then gone ahead and become an NUS MEM alumni as well. I graduated with a Master's of Environmental Management. So I have some basic backing, I could say, to some of the things that I'm going to share with you today. So one of the things that there's 2 points I'm going to make today on the back of the conversations we've had and the presentations we've had by the 2 professors. First, let me start with saying that I think it's very important, something that Professor Edmonds said, that redefining the notion of sustainability, that has to be done at various levels, especially for practitioners, market practitioners like myself. I'm talking about the investment industry, but in the same vein, if you talk to people who are in industry, manufacturing, policy making, urban design, legislation, everyone needs to redefine sustainability. They need to redefine their theories around what they've been doing for the last 25 years. As an investor, I've had to redefine how risk return is being impacted or is being calculated for companies into my investment theory. I've now included impact into that. In the same vein, if you look at policymakers, whether it be urban design makers, they have to decide how they're going to have to redefine the sustainability theory behind urban design. And this is where, again, once again, I want to thank the theory being tested by researchers such as Professor Tay and also Edmonds, that without the help of institutes such as IPS, SSIA, and even the work from various other academic institutions, without that, practitioners like us would not have the proof for change in our philosophy, our thinking, our theory, and then bring it into practice. So I think that should not be underestimated as a point, that what we are sharing here today, people like myself who've in the past been using different practices now are really embracing, understanding, looking at the proof. It's giving us confidence to take that leap of faith in all our individual sectors. And once again, kudos to the various researchers and academics who give us practitioners that, you could say confidence. The second point very quickly I will make is that purpose. When Alex Edmonds defines purpose in a company, the biggest challenge as a practitioner for myself as an investor is, how do you define purpose for a company? How do you find companies with purpose? And he gave his definition, which is about improving the society. On a practical level, we've taken it another level. What we think as investors is that we want to find companies that make a change in the industry that they're in. Because if you can, as a company, if you are, let's say, a packaging company, if you are a telecom company, if you're even an investment manager like ourselves, if you change the industry that you're in and in a positive way, you will have a purpose. And that purpose, therefore, can focus your team, focus your philosophy, focus your process, even therefore focus your profit. And I think that's where expecting a company to be perfect is not correct. Expecting a company to have purpose is a definite must. And from, again, that goes back to, for me, for my team, and I'm very happy to have a co-panelist, Melissa Lowe, who's also one of our stewards of purpose for my firm, guiding us, making sure that we as an investment management firm, what can we do that brings best practices into our industry, which is funds management, which then leads to the whole industry changing and therefore leading to purpose. Having a purpose and therefore leading to a better outcome for the society. And with that, I think I will pass on to my co-panelists and happy to answer any questions on the practicality of how we actually give examples. I can give examples later on how we actually find companies with purpose and how they have proven for us to be invaluable in our portfolio. So with that, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Vineet. And thank you for passing the baton over to Melissa. So Melissa, the time is yours.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ong and IPS for inviting me to be on this panel. I'm grateful, of course, to Professor Edmonds and Professor Tay for their earlier presentations, and Munib, of course, for his insightful remarks. I would like to focus my short remarks on what a green recovery means for Singapore. As all of you know, COVID-19 has certainly been a shock to the global economy and individuals. We do know now that countries are already demonstrating their commitment to addressing the ongoing climate crisis while working to contain the virus and to manage its impacts. We know that countries around the world want to build back better and ensure a green recovery. But it remains to be seen what this will look like in practice. In broad terms, a green recovery might mean an aggressive shift away from fossil fuels. But for Singapore, it can be much more than that. It means building up capabilities for a competitive and sustainable low-carbon future. The goal, as we navigate through this pandemic, should be to ensure an inclusive and climate-resilient transition. As Prof. Tay earlier mentioned, the Singapore government moved quickly to ensure that such plans are on paper and on track. In March last year, 2020, Singapore submitted its enhanced nationally determined contributions to peak emissions at 65 million tons of CO2 equivalent around 2030, and its long-term low emissions development strategy to halve emissions from its 2030 peak, 65 million tons of CO2 equivalent to 33 million tons CO2 equivalent by 2050, with a view to achieving net zero emissions as soon as viable in the second half of the century. Major fiscal packages were created, drawing down nearly $100 billion from past reserves this financial year to help Singaporeans tide over and position the country for future growth and to support a competitive transition to a greener future. The Ministry of Sustainability and the Environment, formerly known as the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources, has said that it plans to create 4,000 new and upgraded green jobs this year and 55,000 over the next decade as Singapore pursues sustainable development. Where are these jobs going to come from, you ask? Jobs are likely to open up in environmental services and the food and agri-technology industries, as Singapore hopes also to enhance food security amid the pandemic. The question remains, however, do we have the deep expertise in climate science and environmental technologies to reduce emissions at the scale and speed that we want? And indeed, maybe a second question is required. Is expertise enough to ensure a smooth green recovery? So realistically, reducing emissions in an absolute fashion is challenging for Singapore. As companies here pivot away from fossil fuels and towards lower carbon alternatives, we can be sure that job cuts and the need to retrain workers to go into other industries will be important. It's in fact already a reality and will need to be addressed very quickly. Identifying retrenched workers from fossil-related industries and ascertaining such desire to be reskilled into other jobs is not a given. It's extremely challenging. Much depends on the role of these workers and whether their skill sets are currently transferable, say for instance to the clean technology sector that we talk about a lot. A green recovery can only happen if we aggressively develop new capabilities and expertise for both immediate and long-term needs, so that Singapore can be at the forefront of green innovation. I mean, one immediate, what we call low-hanging fruit that can happen right now is to prepare our families, educational institutions, and individuals for the change that's happening or coming. Everyone needs to be on board with the message that green-collar jobs and a clean economic recovery is essential to building back better, as well as achieving Singapore's climate goals, which will have to be enhanced again in 5 years' time. That's under the Paris Agreement. COVID-19 has revealed that society places emphasis on measures of success that go beyond GDP growth, including happiness, health, equality for all, for citizens and non-citizens alike. So instead of only saying that we need to create jobs for Singaporeans and lay the foundations for future growth and improve long-term competitiveness, we should also qualify that such jobs should be inclusive and they take into consideration our position on climate change. We must not shy away from difficult conversations. Singapore is a small, open, and trade-dependent nation, and so we should expect such trade-offs, including those that require us to choose between economic growth, sustaining middle-income jobs, such as the ones that Senior Minister Tharman mentioned this morning, and emissions reduction. But the key is to have those important conversations so that we can find innovative solutions together. We must do this if we want such recovery to be truly inclusive. Coming to the end, to conclude, while it is the Singapore government's priority, or all government's priority, to create jobs and strengthen social safety nets during this unprecedented crisis, everyone has a part to play in creating the right environment to develop a pipeline of inclusive and climate resilient jobs and competitive advantages so that we may continue to survive using less resources for a low carbon future to become a reality. A green recovery doesn't mean anything if we come out of this pandemic with the same mindset and actions as before. And so, therefore, as a society, we should begin by thinking critically and acting more consciously so that we can recover better. Thank you. And I'm happy to pass the time on to my colleague Vera for his remarks. Thank you.
Yes, Vera, over to you, please.
All right, thanks very much, Dr. Ong, Dr. Melissa, and the insightful speakers before me for their comments. So as a brief introduction, I consult in the space between sustainability, technology innovation, and community development. And much of the work involves bringing together multiple stakeholders, MNCs, local SMEs, government agencies, and communities to pursue SDG projects in Asia. So for my remarks, I'll basically focus on the role of innovation technology as we pursue a green recovery in Singapore. So I think, like many of you know, Singapore's technology innovation hub, and there are many exciting things happening in the technology space, especially when it comes to sustainability. So 3 of those areas which I'll talk about is about food. We have alternative proteins from urban agriculture. We have energy. We are trying to phase out internal combustion engines. There's a promise of a hydrogen economy that will hopefully replace the carbon economy that we have. And also we have digital marketplaces to distribute energy as well. In terms of waste, a lot of work is happening in terms of material recovery from electronic waste, recovering from food, from plastics, and so on. But of course, we must temper our enthusiasm. I think one of the things technology space is there's always something new and shiny happening, but they always come with their own set of trade-offs. And I think as we consider some of these new developments, we need to think about the increase in energy use that we expect. So as it is, urban agriculture and the manufacturing of alternative proteins and data centers, all of these are using more energy than traditional agriculture, than in the internet data centers as they used to be. So I think we must keep an eye on that. We also need to keep an eye on the health impact. So what is the long-term health impact, for example, of alternative proteins, about intensive digital technology use? I think we can see that overnight, right, not say overnight, but over the last year, in fact, not just adults, but even kids, right, have been using digital technologies and so on. In fact, I read about this joke that basically said that the kid has 5 Zoom meetings in a day and wishes that some of these were actually emails, right? So these are conversations happening younger, but what is the impact of that in terms of the mental health, in terms of the emotional development or social development of people? And of course, I think one of the things is access availability, which we have always known hasn't been there, and COVID-19 simply exposed and accelerated that lack of access and that lack of availability. So similarly, in sustainable food, energy, jobs, will it only be available for those who are economically privileged? I think these are questions that are worth considering as we look at technology. Now, the other aspect of it is innovation, right? I think one of the things in innovation philosophy that we need to really think about as we move towards a green recovery is moving from the language of exploitation to the language of regeneration. So what do I mean by that, right? So when you talk about exploitation in innovation, it's about like, oh, let's conquer a marketplace, let's go, capture this and capture that. That kind of aggressive, exploitative language is a lot to do with how we actually approach some of these things. Now, as we try to widen the space for including people in the innovation process, I think we need to think also about regeneration. And the concept of regeneration is not new. It comes from permaculture from the 70s and earlier. And it's the idea that whatever activities that we're doing to develop new solutions to the problems that are emerging, we do so in a way that we don't create more problems, or we do so in a way that tends to improve the current situation as it is. A good example I talk about regeneration is some of the soil. As we try and grow plants, crops, and try to increase the intensity of it, are we keeping the soil healthy? Are we packing nutrients back in there? So some companies are doing great work in this area. For example, one of these projects that I've learned about is about Interface. Interface has their factory as a forest, as they call it. That's what the project name is. And the idea is to build a regenerative factory. So ideas like that and the underlying philosophy of innovation, I believe, has to change. Another exciting area, of course, is in the space of circular economy. I think circular economy has become more mainstream today. It's really about closed-loop manufacturing, remanufacturing, repair. And I think the Accelerated Process Responsibility Act the Singapore government has passed is a great sign, a great step that actually we're taking this seriously as a country. Circular economy also means that every product that today is physical, we got to think about how that product can be delivered as a service, how we can move from physical to digital, and so on. And last but not least, the 3P partnership model is something that we know works, but we also know is very difficult to do. I think in this context, while Singapore is small, what we can serve is a role as a catalyst, as an initiator of such 3P projects to signpost the way for others in terms of how we can work together and deliver some of these complex projects to very complex problems in a way that tells others, hey, you can do it this way too, and so that our country can also benefit from not just the green recovery of Singapore, but the green recovery of the region and the world at large. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vera. So we've actually now entered the Q&A segment of this forum, and what I'd like to do would be actually to share with you share with the speaker as well as the discussant some of the questions that have emerged in the pigeonhole, and I'll probably ask the one that stands out to me the most, and I think that can be addressed by Munib, if you do not mind. And so Damien is the person who wrote this question, and he asked, is environmental sustainability actually for the financially able, right, for the able? So he said that Prof. Edmonds actually talked about big MNCs, and Munib yourself also started focusing on environment and sustainability after making it in your earlier career. So is it actually cost effective then for SMEs to practice environment and sustainability?
Sure. So I think one of the things that people have to keep in mind, whether you're a small company like us, SME, medium to large enterprise, or even a mega MNC, your environmental footprint, you should know. Once you know your environmental footprint, from there you can work backwards as to what you can achieve. So, and that is something that when we look at companies across the globe, whether it be a large MNC with global footprint or a small, medium-sized company in, let's say, South Africa, we do not expect them to have the same environmental, let's say, targets that are maybe ascribed by some kind of, a standard. What we expect them to do is to know through their own stakeholder engagement what exactly they can actually deliver on. The most important word here is stakeholder engagement. If you haven't, as a company, whether it's an SME, a small company like ourselves, or even a large MNC, if you have not done a stakeholder engagement, the chances of you even knowing what you can do or cannot do in terms of environmental impact cannot be done. And from that perspective, I don't think positive environmental impact is only for the rich or for the big companies. It can be done at various levels. Every small little step actually makes a difference. So hopefully that answers the question on environmental sustainability and financial wherewithal of a company.
Yes, and thank you very much, Munib. I think Simon?
Can I chip in on this? I started very broad, but Estebai and I have also worked on the question of SMEs, innovation, and how to basically help move change. I think the questioner has a good point. Many of the growth stories will be about the bigger company because they have the capacity to engage stakeholders, think through their options, generate new options, create technologies. What Olam and Wilma have done really set a benchmark. But one of the changes is that whether those changes the big companies make will trickle down the supply chain. So Olam, for example, and Wilma deal not only with their own products they grow, but a lot of smallholders. The resource sector, like palm oil, is often really millions of smallholders trickling up the supply chain. And even on preventing fires or preventing harm, it's easier for the big companies to do it. And the critical part is to help trickle down that chain into the smallholders. Similarly for innovation. One of Olam's challenges and opportunities is to create distribution of their data about how the farmers can grow. So Sunny, who has become really a leader in this area, talks about his sense of purpose, as Professor Edmonds talked about, to put information in the hands of all these smallholders across distant rural areas so that they can plant at the right time, they can avoid mistakes, and they can reap innovation. Similarly for Wilma in trying to bring in the smallholders and many other resource companies. So I think that it's not a question of the big companies go only. The effects on the supply chain can be to bring up. The challenge will be if we do it too quickly and wrongly, the pressure will be to cut off SMEs. For example, banks, they're starting to face questions. If they're a green bank and all three Singaporean banks have made major steps forward, and in Japan, I was an advisory board of MUFG, they've made a major step forward. Do they engage the people who have not moved forward with them, or do they stop the finance? If they stop the finance, they may make their shareholders and green activists happy, but they lose leverage to make positive change.
Thank you very much, Prof. Tay. So we actually have another question, and that pertains to Prof. Edmund's statement. I think that relates to what Prof. Tay and Munib actually talked about briefly. And Lynette says that she strongly resonates with Prof. Edmund's statement about sustainability creating value, but she feels we are not seeing investors actually rewarding sustainable companies. And she wants to know what speakers think. Is there enough incentive?
Yeah. So I think, as even Professor Tay said, that there's substantial amount of funds going into ESG funds. Now, I think a lot of them are very, arguably some of those ESG funds can be very basic ESG, like just exclusionary ESG. But I do think increasingly companies, whether it be listed companies or even unlisted companies, whether it be through cheaper loans that banks are giving, there's no doubt if you go to a bank and tell them, I am going to be creating a coal-fired thermal generator, they're going to say, well, see you later, bye-bye. If you go and tell them, I'm, by the way, creating a hydro, water, or water-related or geothermal, they'll be saying, please come in. We'll give you a discounted rate. So whether it be cheaper lending, whether it be equity in private equity space, or whether it be investors like myself in listed equities, there is no doubt money being focused and funneled towards companies that are focused and have a purpose with sustainability beyond just environment. It has to be around human capital, in our view, it's around about social capital, and it has to be around environmental capital. If those three forms of capital are being respected and rewarded, only then can financial capital gain. And that's the purpose that we believe in.
Corinne, could I chip in on this?
Yes, sure.
I think that I understand the call for urgency and a little bit of impatience there. If you look at the non-ESG funds, the non-green funds, they're still far larger than the ESG funds. And the number of green companies is still, frankly, in the minority. But that's how change happens. Sometimes it's a kind of leading edge, and then they'll pull the early adopters. And I think that really the last 3 years have seen rapid change. The number of ESG funds in our region, the steps that, say, Temasek Holdings have made, now public, the steps that we expect GIC to announce quite soon. And I notice they're one of your sponsors for this overall series. I really think that the corner has been turned, and I expect the rate of change to be exponentially much faster. More can happen, and financial reward is critical. For example, to go back to Wilma and not to tout the stock or anything like that, they innovatively negotiated a deal with a number of banks where they meet a certain number of KPI on the ESG front, they will get a lower rate on their loans. So they are being financially rewarded. But on the other hand, palm oil as a whole is not being financially rewarded, even for the companies that produce sustainable palm oil as opposed to exploitative, non-sustainable palm oil. They don't get a price difference in the market. So there are still a lot of gaps in the market in terms of selling of resources, commodities. Energy pricing is similar, and I think Melissa knows this much better than I do.
Great. Melissa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, just very quickly. I do worry about the impact of COVID on renewable energy investment, for instance. And I mean, if I were just to look at Singapore, for example, the market has also evolved quite a lot the last few years, because we now have an open electricity market, as all of you know, and there's a lot of competition, right? And so prices already from fossil generation has come down somewhat, and renewable energy, while it's at parity, so solar energy in Singapore, what happens when you get rainy days like the last few weeks? It's also tricky to maintain grid stability and reliability, which Singapore obviously prides when there's intermittency involved in renewable energy. And I think the same, I suppose, of course, far more complex issues exist in the rest of the region, but I dare say that we need to pay attention. A lot of the models that we are still relying on for policy making were done with pre-COVID data, something to keep in mind, right? So even Singapore's targets, if you think about it, we announced it in February during budget. So that was done by Senior Minister Teo Chee Hean. That was announced in February. This is before COVID absolutely hit us. So the targets that we set and other countries set might be very ambitious in light of COVID if it doesn't let up. So something just to add to the conversation.
Yes. Thank you very much, Melissa. And I think you raised an important point about the unexpected, right? So just wondering, with COVID having hit us, what do you think is the impact of, COVID, this pandemic on, the trajectory of green growth, right? And sustainable corporations, right? What do you foresee is the impact of it?
Right. Thanks for that, Karine. So earlier last year, actually, when COVID hit, a lot of, maybe I just speak for myself and not the other colleagues in the energy, environment, sustainability space. Actually, a lot of us felt very, we felt like we had to mute our voice somewhat, because what could be more important than dealing with the pandemic, right? So you want to go out there and talk about climate action, talk about, the green transition. Very difficult when people are fighting for their lives. I think we've at least here, we've reached a steady state, but not so much for the rest of the world, right? So I think we still approach the narrative with a lot of caution, because we do know that there are international talks that are planned for the end of the year. But my sense is that the inclusiveness might be at stake, because if people, stakeholders beyond states, do not get to attend, right? So civil society, businesses, and various other stakeholders are not allowed to attend the the climate negotiations meetings, for example, biodiversity meetings, and so on. It might sort of dilute the critics' voice that you mentioned in your opening remarks. So I think it's really important to pay attention to some of these sort of, we hear all these murmurings of people getting upset about non-inclusivity with regard to the recovery, which I mentioned in my remarks, but nothing really concrete institutional is being done about it. So I think the pace would have to be adjusted, because once people start to realize that inclusivity is very important, I think this will probably slow down the pace of green growth in a way, because to include inclusiveness, essentially.
Right.
Yeah.
Very important insights. And just wondering also to Simon and Munib, right? Do you think the pandemic would actually spark a mindset of short-termism among companies as they are trying to rebound, right, from the crisis economically, and therefore might have a trade-off with sustainability? Simon or Munib, any one of you can go ahead.
Vera, would you like to go first?
No, please, Professor, you go.
Okay. I think what Melissa said in your question is a real danger. That's why I meant that we are kind of an important juncture or inflection point. We either get better, or we really will be in first this crisis, we'll muddle through this crisis, and then we'll bump into another longer term crisis called the climate change effects, which are already starting to be felt and visible. But I am slightly more optimistic than Melissa, at least today, where I think that there are ways to twin the two. In a lot of our discussion about resilience, producing things nearer will avoid carbon. Some of the jobs that can be created in the green economy can be very inclusive. For example, there are a number of people who are trying to retrofit solar panels and other energy-saving devices in more temperate countries. And this can be done by fairly skilled, but not really rocket scientists. It can be a trained, basically skill to help of these kits to help mass adoption of energy-saving devices. Similarly, I mentioned how nature-based solutions might be a great effort for Southeast Asia, locking up carbon by regenerating forests, mangrove swamps, peatlands, which are a great source of the haze and carbon, outsized problem globally. This regeneration isn't by professors like me going and volunteering to dig canals. It will be about bringing livelihoods and rewards to the local rural communities to really give them another source of income besides growing sustainable crops. So I think that while the danger is there, we have to recognize it and enable and push forward the solutions that both help recovering the pandemic and the economic recovery pandemic together with the greener, lower carbon solutions. So while we've not mentioned sustainability as much as we have climate so far, I think that's important because sustainability brings in that human dimension. Those laborers, those workers, the citizens who need protection from the pandemic, as well as the climate change crisis that is emerging.
Thank you very much, Simon. You need to have anything to add?
Yes, well, I'm a very optimistic person. You can see behind me is to infinity and beyond. So, you know, I'm going to be the most optimistic and finish on an optimism note. I actually think 20 years from now, and without taking away from the pandemic that we are living through now and many people are suffering through, if I look 20 years out, I'm very optimistic around the green energy. The genie is out of the bag. The whole decarbonization, the whole idea of how hydrogen can be used, how electric vehicles can be used in Singapore. And I'm talking about Singapore here, that I do think we have got some really good momentum within Singapore, even with COVID and the government having to deal with COVID. Beyond that, we are going to see a very good decarbonization policy and process and eventual actualization within Singapore within the next 20, 30 years. So I do think we will hit our NDC targets. Melissa, I hope we do.
Thank you, Vineet and Simon. So I think there is actually quite an interesting question from the audience. Actually, more than one person has asked the question of how the government can actually play a part in encouraging more sustainable businesses to get up right in this ecosystem. And maybe Vera, would you like to make any comments on this?
Sure. I mean, I'm not from the government, so I think this will merely come from an advisory standpoint in terms of what I've seen work elsewhere. I think, of course, I mean, governments in most cases play a regulatory role to set up the framework for it, and particularly in Singapore, there's another tool, which is the tool of the grants, right, which they often use to great effect. So I would expect, like, so I think one of the things that I did suggest, in fact, not too long ago, was about, you know, how for digital transformation in Singapore, we actually have a very elaborate grant scheme for SMEs to tap on to engage digital services and for their point of sale and a bunch of other services. Something similar we could consider and we could roll out for SMEs in the green transformation space. I think that's something worth considering. Of course, there may not be as many or as rich variety of solutions available for the average SME to pick and choose. But I think those are mechanics that can be worked through. But in general, I think taking that sort of concentrated approach, which I think is not out of the question for our government to put together, I think that's something that's going to really help SMEs. I work with a lot of SMEs through my banking clients, and one of the things that you know they always, or rather the SMEs who I work with mention is that they want stuff that's ready to go because they don't have a lot of time to think about it, right? So they need stuff that's pre-packaged, a little bit plug and play, you know. And so I think solutions like that will tend to work better because, you know, SMEs are generally you know, smaller, especially in decision-making capacity, and they just want to run with it, right? They want to go with it. They're not thinking too far ahead.
Thank you, Vera. Yes, Simon.
I just chip in on this as brief as I can. I think I agree with Vera about setting the standards and the laws. But I think in this sense, I differ a bit from Professor Edmonds. I don't want to overlook this in our region and Singapore. Those ESG reporting standards are relatively new in Singapore. We need to drill down still further, and we need to get assurance that the companies really are not just a matter of policy, but putting them into practice. So the verification, monitoring, and clear reporting remain essential in Singapore and across our region. Without this, the green investments won't really come because you might just be buying into greenwash, a lot of PR, nothing wrong with PR per se, but just only PR rather than actual substance. But the government is also, especially in Singapore, a large landowner, a building owner, a procurer of services. So obviously it has to practice what it preaches. I would look forward to Singapore government rolling out a number of efforts in their own holdings. And that's why I mentioned Temasek and GIC. Additionally, we already know that in Singapore's infrastructure plans, we plan to escalate Changi Airport. Of course, it's been delayed, pandemic, but it remains a long-term goal. We'll have a mega port at Tuas. These should become hallmark projects, hallmarks for efficiency, innovation, reliability, and also sustainability and low carbon. In the past, airports and ports have always been attacked for their carbon miles. So I think that really we need to demonstrate in our own sort of anchor projects here in Singapore that the next generation of infrastructure can really be green. And then when we do that, we should go to the market, as DPM Heng Swee Keat has said, and look for funding for this rather than from taxes, and create a green finance market with real depth and anchored to the steady returns of these landmark projects here in Singapore.
Thank you very much, Simon. So Vera actually have a follow-up question. Just wondering, from your experience in the space of innovation and green growth, do you have any thoughts or even examples, right, of some projects that you think have great potential to be launched, right, and to be actually supported by the government, right, or any other investor in that sense?
Right. So I mean, the one of the perils of working in my space that you can't usually name all the people you work with, right? So I will talk about this fictional packaging company. They're a very large packaging company in the world. And one of the things that they quickly realized is, at least about 2 years back, is that the time for single-use plastics, is soon to be over. The clock is running out on them. And they took a global effort to actually figure out what would be the next evolution of their company itself. From a producer of single-use plastics and single-use packaging to one that basically provides services for reusable packaging. It's a big shift. It's a multi-billion-dollar company, and it's a huge shift for them to consider that. I think so thinking of a company of that standpoint, I mean, such a company is not going to engage in activities because the government wants to do X, Y, and Z. They do it for their own survival, right? That's the starting point. And then I guess the question that our government has is that if you want to invite such companies, you want to invite such organizations, you want to encourage them to pursue those dreams, those transformation initiatives in Singapore, then what can we offer, right, as a country to such organizations? Then I think I will probably follow up with what Prof. Tay mentioned about creating the environment, the ecosystem, and the landmark projects that signal that we are welcome for these things. And of course, when those companies are actually here, having the talent, the space, and all the things that you need whenever you want companies to come in here to actually develop those projects. But more importantly, I think, and I spent some time in intellectual property, is also with the IP regime behind some of these things, and to be able to protect and also distribute some of these technologies. Many companies who come to Singapore for such innovation projects, they view Singapore simply as a stepping stone. And it's not a bad thing. And it's not a bad thing that at least they consider us a stepping stone, but a stepping stone to the larger region. I think we need to take our leadership role in this context, this very specific context, quite seriously. I feel sometimes that we may not really position ourselves that way out of respect for our neighbors, or maybe some of the reasons. But I think if we truly want to signal to the world that we are a gateway for some of these specific types of initiatives and projects, then there's a lot we could do in that respect.
Thank you, Vera. I thought that's a really excellent point, and it was a question that came up for me as well, because the Singapore National Climate Change Secretariat indicates that Singapore has the potential to develop into a green growth hub, right? So this was actually explicitly mentioned. So I was interested to know how that vision, would look like in practice to all of the speakers and discussants. To you, what is your view of that?
If I could begin, and perhaps at the most general one, I think that really our strengths come in as Singapore as a place of partnerships and also like sort of experimental lab space. Now, I don't mean to quibble about words, but we want to be more than just a gateway for people just pass through. We want to make sure that they are rooted here in Singapore, and where possible, we start and curate partnerships with multinationals who partner with the local company of Singapore, and then go out into the region. So it's sort of two parties, and then a third country collaboration of embedding it, say, in Myanmar or whichever country partner there is. We can do this in new technologies, and sometimes there will be requirements for regulatory shifts, for example, autonomous vehicles, right? So Singapore is committed to do that, and the Smart City Initiative, therefore, should be studied, rolled out into other urban spaces across Asia, where possible, through partnerships. So the government has to be enabling this, the partnerships in Singapore with foreign companies and Singaporean companies, and then the export of these goods and services and policy initiatives across the region. I think that will be the critical step to really making Singapore a green, more than a hub, just a green generator of growth. And you're right, I think there is a lot of mixed calls in the region. Sometimes Singaporeans sometimes see too aggressive for our neighbors. They might resent us. They feel they can go direct to the markets. But other times people recognize the value we can bring and add, not just as a middleman, but really create that value added. And that will be the critical part for Singapore's participation in the greening of our region.
Thank you very much, Simon. So it sounds like you are in accord with Vera on that as well, to bring Singapore more than being just a middleman, but actually being a major hub.
And particularly in investment and finance, and not just technology.
Right, thank you. Munib and Melissa, any views on this vision? I'm curious to know how...
Yeah, I'm going to be slightly controversial here, if I may. So, I mean, this is about perspectives. This is about different perspectives, right? So one of the things I would take, let's say, inspiration from is if you look at the United Nations SDGs, right? United Nations SDGs, there's 17 of them. The 17th one is all about partnerships. The other thing that we talked about is that when we look at companies, we want to know what is their purpose, and especially if their purpose is not about being everything to everyone all the time. If we as Singapore want to be part of a greener region, I think we also in Singapore have to realize what is the strength we have. And let's say there'll be certain parts of the United Nations SDGs. If we are almost, let's say, replicating United Nations SDG 17, there might be someone who is much better at being, let's say, the nature-based solution hub. Let's give them, the due consideration and support, whether it be one of our neighbors who actually has the biggest sink or the biggest carbon capture potential. So I think we need to be, as much as a Singaporean, I want everything to be here and everything to be focused in Singapore. I think if we want the region to really come with us, we need to be a bit more open-minded to being sharing in this responsibility. Otherwise, if we're just sitting here doing a lot of the brainstorming, the execution needs to be done on a regional basis. And for that, we need partnerships with our neighbors. And there'll be certain areas where they should develop the skill set with our support, and therefore have a hub there for, let's say, nature-based solution in another country, for water in another country. Why not take a broader base and we be SDG 17? That's my sort of, let's say, one piece of suggestion.
Just jump in quickly to clarify in case I misunderstood or I misspoke. I don't mean that everything has to be in Singapore exclusively. I do take the point that we have to work in partnership. But when we work in partnership, it doesn't mean that the nature-based solutions should be only addressed by the countries with the largest nature, because they will have difficulty and challenges in verification, monitoring, and other carbon services. So there are strengths we have as an existing financial hub, the level of trust we've generated, and then we can bring this into partnership with our various neighbors across the region. So I think I just didn't want to be misunderstood.
Yeah, and just as an example, if you look at, for example, Singapore could be the place where we monetize and put the structure around the financial in vehicles that allow our neighbors to, through their measurement, through their capacity, collaborate with us. So our strength is the financial markets, creating the green financial markets with the, I agree with you, Professor. It's all about collaboration here.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you so much, Munib and Simon. How about Melissa? Do you have any comments?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, if I follow Munib and be a bit controversial as well, I thought it might be valuable to our discussion to talk about what the costs are for green growth, right? Particularly energy. I think somebody raised in the questions about data centers, for example. I thought that's a really interesting point, because it may well be true, right, that when we invite major companies to come here and set up shop, it comes with a cost, and a lot of times it comes at an energy price. Emissions will increase as well, to the point where I think the person who asked the question is alluding to the fact that Singapore had to issue a moratorium on new data centers because it would likely exceed our energy capacity, for example, power generation capacity. While we are at a point today where we have excess capacity, nearly 2 times the amount of energy generation capacity, this is likely to be eaten up almost completely by the new data centers coming on board. So we need to keep in mind that green growth, even if they are green data centers, what is the trajectory for Singapore in the long term? It doesn't make sense to me anyway, if the share of the pie of energy and emissions keeps growing. Well, in the context of the target, we plan to peak at 65. So there's still room for growth, actually. I think in 2017, Singapore's emissions was at 51 million tons. So we're still planning for growth. And I think that's what, in some ways, a lot of people still don't understand, that we're not actually moving towards absolute reduction just yet. We're moving towards an decrease in the rate of increase, right? So I worry a lot about what we're teaching, kids in schools, and because sometimes even simple math or projections like that can be quite challenging. To be honest, even when I first started in research, it was a bit of a challenging concept, right? I'm not a math, I'm not from well, not very strong in math anyway, but I think this is logic, and we need to pay attention to some of these trade-offs that I talked about. Another thing that I thought would be helpful to think about is the kind of pressures that are on our government to achieve this target, right? And I have a little bit of anxiety over, when we talk about climate change, climate action, nobody really has a monopoly on it, right? Everyone has a part to play. And I worry because I see some of the tone and some of the discussion, maybe even a climate motion coming up in Parliament, that this issue could be overly politicized. I certainly do not hope that climate change becomes a bipartisan issue or excessively politicized in Singapore. Very worrying if this is a trend that continues. I think we should all try and work together. Actually, I know there's immense pressure on the government, politicians to speak up about climate change, but I don't think it warrants us fighting over what needs to be done. In fact, we should actually be working together and coming up with the solutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Melissa. That's a very important message, I think, there. So I'd like to just quickly move back to the pigeonhole, where we actually have one question here, and I thought that would be really a nice wrap-up to this session. So the question is from Christopher, and he's asking, what, in the panel's view, are the best game changers that will drive behavioral change by people, by businesses and by governments acting across borders to adopt sustainable practices in our lives? So what are the best game changers that will drive behavioral change? And I just wonder if maybe does Vera want to start off there and give us your insights on this?
Well, that's a really difficult question. I'm glad you pointed to. No, I'm not glad. I'm kidding. All right. So this is interesting, right? I would say the biggest game changer is changing what's within, right? What's inside our mind and the way we perceive and conceive of problems. I think I shared in my remarks as well, is that I talk about innovation philosophy, right? Changing a language of exploitation to a language of regeneration. But the same thing applies for the way we go about life, the way we go about, if we think of life as something that we win at the expense of others, if we start thinking in ways that we got to be kiasi, kiasu, and all the things that are about Singapore that come in, then those are things that will not be helpful at all, right? So I think that's what that would be my response to that question.
Thank you very much, Vera. Very engaging indeed. And does anyone else, maybe, what do you think about game changes? And then we'll move on to Simon.
Just one word: education.
Education. Okay. To the point, yes. Simon.
I wish I could have only one word. Can I squeeze in a few more?
Yes, please.
I think one will be education and generational change. I'm 60. In my generation, sustainability and climate weren't very clearly understood or emphasized. But I detect a real sea change in the younger people. It's much more normal to be concerned about the future climate change and sustainability. The second is that beyond this sense of values or purpose, we must reward values in the other sense. Companies that are innovative, that are watching ESG, that are doing the right thing, have to be rewarded. That's their goal. I think in many points, though he's not here for the Q&A, Professor Edmonds said things which are understood and in fact accepted by many of us at the change level. We have to really look to finance, investment, and the overall market to reward and recognize, and not necessarily punish, but also nudge, quite forcibly nudge the reluctant companies to make a change. And this is going to happen. In this sense, our region is really ripe. The region we live in has been really oftentimes on the lower end of the environmental performance scale, affecting both local problems as well as global problems. We really need to be one of those to work in partnership with our neighbors to push that envelope. So Singapore's very small footprint can get leveraged and magnified through the finance and other levers to really make a sense of change. We are in a crisis, the pandemic. We should not waste this crisis, not just economically, not just innovatively, but in terms of dealing with the longer term sustainability and climate crisis that's emerging.
Thank you very much, Simon. So I think Simon actually gave a very nice, even kind of a concluding statement in that sense for this forum. So we have 5 minutes left, and typically what I'll do will be to close the session, but I'd like to put our speakers and discussants a little bit on the spot, because I think the audience would love to hear more from you, and we have so little time. So if I could ask you to actually give the audience a 1-minute message, or it can be a message or it can be a recommendation that you'd like us to take away with for this forum session. So I just leave it to anyone who'd like to start, who is ready to go. If not, maybe I can nominate Munib. Munib looks ready to go to infinity and beyond.
To infinity and beyond. Yes. So I think going back to just elaborating, basically, I think education and personal education, that's and personal purpose. We talk about purpose. This whole thing, this whole discussion, thanks to Alex, was also around corporate purpose. But what's our personal purpose? And I think once we are well educated, and in terms of not only, in my case, financial capital, but human capital, social capital, the environmental capital as an investor, same with an industry player, a policymaker. If in a professional context and also in a personal context, let's educate ourselves and then redefine our professional and personal purpose. That would be my one advice, is please take 2021 to refine your purpose. Thank you.
Thank you. Wonderful. Thank you, Munib. Simon, 1 minute.
Well, I think I agree with Munib, but additionally, I guess my heart of my presentation was that Singapore is well suited to make a change for ourselves. There will be challenges, but the critical challenge was whether we can move not just our own economy, but really have that influence across the region. We must be green at home and increase our capacity, our innovativeness, etc. But we must use that to move the wider region, to have a sense of partnership and positive influence on a win-win basis.
Excellent summary. Thank you very much, Simon. And Vera, over to you.
Right. So basically the takeaway I would like the audience to walk away with is that it starts with some, I think like Munib mentioned as well, the personal change in terms of how we view the issue, but also I think action is very important. I spent 10 years in this space, not very long, I know, but I'm so done with awareness and education. I'm so done with it. I'm like, it is time for action, right? It is time to get things done. And this time will never come again. This COVID pandemic, post-pandemic situation, we'll never get an opportunity to rewrite the economic story of Singapore as we get the opportunity right now, right? So right now is when we got to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Vera. Very impactful. Melissa.
Yeah, and actually the funny thing is that I think I absolutely agree with the three speakers on this panel. Actually, what I have written down is get up and do. So in addition, I have don't complain. So I think as Singaporeans, we complain a little bit too much. I'm guilty of it too. But if we constantly think that the role of addressing climate change is somebody else's role or somebody else's responsibility, I don't think we will get to our goals. We won't become more ambitious over time. So it's really important, as what Vera says, just get up and do already, and if you can't, then try. What's the worst that can happen?
Thank you, Melissa. Very poignant indeed. So I would like to thank each and every one of the speakers, Simon, Munib, Vera, and Melissa, for your very excellent inputs to this forum. We have benefited a lot, myself included. Wisdom, learning from each of you. So I hope the audience has also benefited, and I'm so sorry that we could not cover all of the questions from the Pigeonhole, but your questions were really very interesting and important, and I hope that we got to answer some of them at least. So thank you very much for joining us in this forum, and we hope that you can join more sessions to come. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Corinne. Maybe convey our thanks to Dr. Corinne Ong for so ably moderating this session. And we'd like to thank all the panelists and all of you for joining in and contributing to the session. Do feel free to continue with your comments on the session's topic of environment and sustainability in the conference chat, as we will be taking all of your inputs today onto our final day plenary sessions on the 25th of January, as well as to the IPS Reimagining Singapore 2030 project. This session has been recorded, and you will be able to review the recording on this conference page. We will take a break now, but please do remember our next session in the conference will begin at 8 p.m. on the global economy, and we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you and good day.